Aharja. You're all very welcome here tonight to this very special talk. And Thomas H. Bach was in the country, and we decided to ask him to come to Armagh. Originally we had spoken about bringing him to Dublin, but we're just bringing him here to Armagh because, you know, it's the real ancient capital of Ireland, and I think he got a little indication of that earlier on today. So ordinarily Gael Linn organise events in Irish or bilingual, but Dr. Thomas H. Bach is such a distinguished authority in his field of study that we felt it was important, irrespective of what language he was going to speak, to bring him here to speak to us all. I've heard Thomas speak a few times now, and he is an excellent speaker. He spoke earlier on in Belfast at Queen's, and he had a PowerPoint and laser gun, and you know, he doesn't want that kind of talk tonight. He wants you to ask questions, and I think that once you hear what he has to say, that it will fire questions in your mind. So you definitely didn't come to hear Raymond O'Keefe. You're sick looking at me, you're probably sick listening to me, but one thing, just by way of introduction, when I was in the Gaeltacht learning Irish, there used to be a phrase, and you heard it regularly, and it ran something like this here: Ní ulach bi changa, is fussa I a umper, which translates that a language is no burden, it's easily carried. But it seems now that not only is a language easily carried, but in a way, languages can carry you, especially in later life, and especially if you're unfortunate enough to suffer from a variety of ailments, which Dr. Bach will cover. So remember that you're here to engage with our special guest. He has a very positive message about languages, the Irish language and all languages, and it's fitting that we're here tonight across from the £2 million Irish Language Cultural Centre, which will open to the public in and around Halloween. It's well underway. The garage there was telling me that the first floor has been actual, like the building's well up, but you could make your way onto the first floor now, it seems. So Gael Linn is one of the lead organisations for the promotion of the Irish language, and we are funded mainly by Forras na Gaeilge. So I'm delighted to welcome Adele ní Churainn here tonight from Forras na Gaeilge. So enough from me. You've been a very interesting guest all day, and the floor is now yours. Thomas H. Bach, and here we have his Twitter.
So if you tweet anything, just tag me. So firstly, I want really to, excuse myself for not being able to give this talk in Irish. Habe kan galig na halabaikem, ach hanil mi tikshing galig na heirein hamidurich. So I can pick up some words like Tonga for Tongan language, but as I say, unfortunately, that's so far by now. Maybe it will change. So, let me just start with with a quiz, or putting you in the right frame of mind. Now imagine that as a doctor, I come to you and say that I have now discovered a strange medical condition which leads to cognitive deficits, so attention deficits above all, which accelerates cognitive aging, so it means people lose their cognitive abilities faster as they age, which makes earlier the onset of dementia, and which has negative influence on recovery from stroke. You would say, oh God, that sounds pretty awful. And then I would tell you, well, but there is a bit of good news as well. So what's the good news? It is perfectly treatable if recognized. Wouldn't you tell me, wow, we should invest in this treatment? Well, the condition I'm speaking about is monolingualism. And I very consciously want to turn the tables. In many discussions, particularly in the Anglosphere, there is a kind of strong assumption that there is something absolutely normal about people being monolingual, and being bilingual or multilingual is some kind of weirdos which, in a way, need to be explained. We don't really understand how their brain works and so on. So this is, so to say, the abnormal. And you will find it, and I mean, I've been culprit myself. In many of my papers I write, the influence of bilingualism on so and so. I should probably write the influence of monolingualism. So, to start with, I think this turning the tables is really important for several reasons. Firstly, let me start with human evolution. Now, I have been extremely fortunate to work over the last few years with Nick Evans, who is probably one of the world-leading field linguists, who has done a lot of work in Papua New Guinea, in Australia, Aboriginal Australia, and so on. And according to him, the vast majority of hunter-gatherer societies that exist today in places as remote as Amazon, Africa, Papua New Guinea, Australia, and so on, tend to be multilingual. So there is a very strong assumption that the human language developed in multilingual surroundings. So basically, for 95% or 97% of our evolutionary history, we have been multilingual. And it's only a very recent, so to say, a very recent phenomenon that monolingualism is perceived as the norm. I mean, it has been certainly not. So our brain is perfectly well adapted to learn languages throughout our lifetime. And that's what happens, as I say, in a lot of hunter-gatherer nomadic societies. The second point is multilingualism. In fact, if you look across the world, beyond the Anglosphere, you find out that the majority of the world is in fact multilingual. So I remember, if I give a talk, let's say, particularly in England, in Scotland it's a little bit better, but if I give a talk in England, people would say, well, do you want to tell us that it's possible for a human being to learn another language? Now I remember I was giving a talk about it in Entebbe, in Uganda, to the Society of African Neuroscientists, and the first question after the talk was, sir, that's all very interesting what you told me, or told us, but I come from Ghana, we all speak 3 to 4 languages. Is it much better if I speak 5, 6, or 7? So that's the question translated into Africa. Another country in which I work a lot is India. And in India you have millions of people who are illiterate, they never went to school, and yet they are fluent in 2 or 3 languages. And I want to come to India because that's where, in fact, some of the most interesting evidence came from. Now, the idea that bilingualism can delay the onset of dementia was first articulated quite exactly 11, 12 years ago, 2007, by a group of LM in Toronto, in Canada. So what they did is, I don't know if, has any of you been to Toronto? Yeah, it's amazingly multilingual place. I mean, you can't walk down the street without hearing, half a dozen languages. And interestingly also, I mean, Toronto is a good example. I will come to medicine in a moment, but also, have you ever heard about racial riot in Toronto? I haven't. So in a way, so the idea that multilingualism makes society split, divided, violent, and so on is complete rubbish. It's one of the most peaceful places you can get to. I mean, the biggest political problem they had was a mayor who was, taking drugs and saying embarrassing things on TV. If that's your biggest political problem, it's probably not so bad. But anyway, so in Toronto as well, they have something very, very good. Namely, if you are trapped in a hospital, a routine question is always, which language do you speak? And they do it because, for instance, if people now suddenly get a stroke or and so on, and then fall back to speak their original language, they know which language it was. So it was relatively easy to look through the acts they had of 250 patients with dementia. Roughly half of them turned out to be multilingual, half of them turned out to be monolingual, and those who spoke more than one language developed dementia 4 years later. Now 4 years is an incredibly long time. I mean, 25 years of research and over $25 billion has brought the drugs which can maybe change a couple of months. So that means it's a much bigger effect than any drug effects that we have at very, very big costs. So from this point of view, it was revolutionary. What was the problem with the study? Well, the problem was that most of the people who spoke more than one language were in fact immigrants. A lot of them came or were children of people coming, for instance, Jewish families from Central Eastern Europe who were fleeing from Nazi persecution and so on. So from this point of view, the criticism was developed that maybe it's not about language, maybe immigrants are healthier. I mean, you have to be robust, so to say, to emigrate, to survive emigration, settle in a new country. Maybe it's a difference in their lifestyle, food, even genetics. It was very difficult to tell apart. So that was the moment where I, reading this paper, I got immediately, wow. I mean, I've been working in dementia for over 20 or 30 years by now, and I have been interested in languages for, I would say, since I was growing up in Poland with a Polish-speaking father and German-speaking mother. So I thought that's a kind of way of combining my interest in language with my interest in dementia and neurology. And then I thought immediately, why don't we go to India? Because in India, multilingualism has been the rule for centuries. So I went to Hyderabad, and I had a colleague with whom I worked already in Cambridge, in UK, and she went back to Hyderabad, so I knew the situation. I said, why don't we do some studies on bilingualism there? And, as I say, the advantage in Hyderabad is you can look at people who speak different languages or just one language, and their families have been there for generations, so you have no influence of immigration. So that's one thing. But you can also even minimize the influence of education, because you have, as I say, a lot of people who speak many languages and never went to school. They are illiterate, so their education is, so to say, formal education is zero. And we did a study which was 3 times bigger than the Toronto study, and we found exactly the same 4 years interval. Interestingly, in illiterates, the difference was even bigger, 6 years. So from this point of view, and a lot of other studies show also that the effects of bilingualism are particularly pronounced in people coming from lower educational and lower socioeconomic status. There you find the difference even bigger than you find. And that is also something which I find very important, because in Britain very often people associate, languages, there are posh schools which offer French and so on and so on. It's not about the poshes, it's basically one of the, as I say, if we assume that, for millions of years, or I say hundred-thousands of years, as hunter-gatherers, we were multilingual. That is the most natural thing. We don't need formal schooling to learn more than one language. So then, after we did several studies. So we did first a study on dementia, then we did a study on MCI, mild cognitive impairment, which is basically like an earlier presentation of dementia. So it's like an impairment which is not severe enough to be called dementia, and we found also quite a big difference between bilinguals and monolinguals. And then we did a study in stroke, because we thought, after dementia, the second biggest problem in neurology for our brain is stroke. So we looked again at people who spoke one language and more than one, and we found that those who spoke more than one language recovered much faster. there was no difference in the age of stroke. So the bad news is it doesn't matter how many languages you speak. If you are due to have a stroke because of your genetics or lifestyle, then you will get it. However, the good news is, if you get a stroke, you recover faster if you speak more than one language cognitively. So from this point of view, there were a series of studies which all pointed in the same direction. And that caused quite a lot of interest, but then I thought, okay, so let's then look now at the normal development, so to say, normal healthy aging. Now, one of the problems, again, of the criticism was, well, maybe, people said, what you are looking is an example of reverse causality. So, reverse causality is basically a scientific term, what in everyday language we would call the chicken and hen problem. What was first? So, it's a chicken and egg problem. So, is it that people who are more clever are more likely to learn a language, or is it that learning a language makes us more clever? It's not very easy to solve, but in Scotland we are very lucky because all Scottish school children, when they were 11, in 1947, were tested for their intelligence. It was the only country which really had a practically test, I think 4th of June, 47. All kids who were 11 at that time were tested. And in Edinburgh, one of my collaborators, the director of Cognitive Epidemiology Institute, managed to find all the acts, all the files of people living still in Edinburgh area, around 1,000, so quite a lot. So we could then look, how does their performance now compare with them as children, if we know whether they learn another language or not. Obviously, your childhood IQ predicts a little bit your late age IQ. So people who were very, very best, age 11, are more likely to be up the top. It's not 100% because you might have, for instance, a lot of strokes and have a lot of problems, but generally there is a prediction. And what we found is people who learned another language to a level that they were able to communicate in it had a better performance than you would predict from the childhood. So that was as close as you can get to the proof that it's not just that being clever makes you more likely to learn languages, but that learning languages can make you cleverer. So then we thought, okay, but in that case, we need to be able to find cognitive effects in people learning languages. So the first study we did of this type was at the Edinburgh University. We're looking at students in the 1st and 4th year. So we have 4 years courses in Scotland. I know in Ireland is it 3, bro? I mean in England it's 3, in Scotland is 4, so it's 1 year longer. I'm not sure here. So we're looking at 1st and 4th year, and we compared students of languages with students of other humanities. So history, literature, and so on. If we looked at their attention, so things where they had to concentrate, count numbers, and so on, switch attention, then those were not different in 1st year. Whatever you study, you had roughly the same performance. But in the 4th year, people who studied languages were much better in switching their attention. So they could, so to say, switch faster between going upwards, downwards, and so on. So bigger mental flexibility. I come to it in a moment explaining that. So then we thought, okay, 4 years, that's great. But no, 4 years is a long period. As I say, we didn't test the same people. We would have to wait for 4 years, which is a long time. So I had probably one of the craziest ideas of my professional life. I said, let's see whether we can find an effect after 1 week. So I sent a master students to Salmore Ostak, which is the Gaelic college on the Isle of Skye, which is offering intensive Gaelic courses. For 1 week, about 14 hours teaching, but plus, of course, you have movies, theater, music, and so on. So it's really quite an intensive course. And I said to these master students, look, this is a kind of high risk. I mean, very likely nothing will come out of it, but in worst case, you spend a couple of weeks in one of the most beautiful places in Scotland, so I would go for it. And she said, well, I am game for it, I go. So she went, and I couldn't believe the results. All people improved after 1 week. Now you can say, well, is it simply because they learned the tests? No, because we reran the test in Edinburgh, people who didn't go to the course, and there was absolutely flat curve, so they were not better after 1 week. So it's not, we have something called practice effects, it's not that they were simply better on the tests. Can we get it through other things? We were looking in Edinburgh and people who went to a so-called CELTA course, so it's a teaching course for people who want to teach English to foreign speakers, so it's language related but not foreign language related. They improved a little bit, but nowhere near the level on the Isle of Skye. And the question is, okay, so if it comes, after 1 week, will it disappear after 1 week if people don't practice? Well, that's exactly the question. So 9 months later, we retested as many people as we could get, and those who practiced 5 hours a week, so 1 hour a day basically without weekends, remained the improvement 9 months down the line. So from this point of view, I would say that is probably the fastest effect that we could find. And at the moment, we went further, so one of the things which I think is also quite interesting is, on the Isle of Skye, you have, if you go to these classes, they have an age range which is really from 18 to 80. So our youngest participants were 18, our oldest was 78. In fact, it was quite sweet because last year I was giving this talk in Edinburgh Fringe, and then after the talk, an elderly lady came up to me and said, "Well, thank you very much for speaking about me in your talk." And I said, well, I didn't recognize her quite. And she said, well, now you're a bit perplexed, but I am the person who was 78, 2 years ago at the study. Now I am 80. I cannot travel to Isle of Skye now because of physical problems, but I still do my Gaelic here in Edinburgh. So from this point of view, you get this effect, and I'm particularly interested in language learning in later life. And one of the reasons is, coming from the background, we usually think of language and multilingualism and so on as something connected with children. I will come to children in a moment, but it can be the whole lifetime. So I'm particularly interested in language learning in retirement. I think it's one of the best things you can do in retirement, and both for social and cognitive reasons. And that's why I was particularly interested in this group. So at the moment we are doing in Scotland, together with a group, Glasgow-based group called Lingo Flamingo, we are doing special courses for retired people and even for patients with early dementia. And we don't have enough numbers to say whether there was a cognitive improvement or not, but at least we can say it was well tolerated and people loved it. And one thing I can say immediately is, they said it's such a great experience that I thought when I was diagnosed with dementia that I cannot do anything, I cannot learn anything new. And now the fact that I can learn a language is, for me, the best thing that happened since the diagnosis. So we got an incredibly positive response from patients, and from their relatives, and from the carers in Alzheimer's centers. So from this point of view, I could say we have now, and I haven't spoken about evidence in childhood, but this came already earlier. So Białystok, the author of the paper on bilingualism and dementia 2007, spent the 20 years before that looking at bilingual children and showing that they in fact develop their skills faster than monolingual ones. And here maybe it's a kind of time to bring a little bit of my personal history, because I am a kind of lost opportunity. I was born in Poland, I mentioned, in 1960s, and my mother was a German speaker, my father was a Polish speaker. They were both doctors, my mother was a pediatrician, so they were trying to ask the professionals, should we teach both languages to the child, or should we, first speak Polish and maybe once it grows up then we will do some German. And that was what the speech and language therapists, what the doctors, what the specialists said. The idea was, if you teach 2 languages at the same time, the children get confused, don't learn any language properly, and might become schizophrenic at the end. That was, so my parents consciously decided not to teach me German. Now, another thing which I have to add here is, it was not for political reasons. So, German in Poland might be a kind of slightly ambiguous, as you can imagine. However, I could see from my mother's and my father's side completely different, so to say, political attitude to language. My mother grew up in Silesia, and in the time when she was a schoolgirl in, under Hitler's Germany, she told me she remembered that going to school, the slogan above the door of the school was, "Whoever speaks Polish is our enemy." So there was a certain linguistic battleground, and as you can imagine, after 45, whoever spoke German was the enemy. So it changed, so let's say the extreme character of the attitude didn't change, just the things changed around. Now my father came from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, where German was in fact the lingua franca of everybody. I mean, you had about 20 nations speaking 20 different languages, and if you had a Pole, a Czech, a Romanian, a Hungarian, and Ukrainian, let's say, meeting, none of whom would have been German native speakers, they were still speaking German with each other because that was the common language. So it means in old Austro-Hungary, German didn't have negative connotation. It was simply the practical language, like, let's say, English is now for communication across the world. It was simply the lingua franca of Central and Eastern Europe. So from this point of view, because I was growing up in Krakow, which was the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was no political problems in raising me bilingually. So the problems were very clearly, the kind of the fear of the cognitive side effects. Now I know, looking from history, ironically, around the time where I was born, in Montreal, the first studies started showing that in fact learning more than one language is a good thing and not a bad thing. Till then, a lot of literature was suggesting that learning two languages as a child is bad for intelligence. Some of them coming, for instance, from Wales. We now know what were the problems. They were comparing rural Wales with, so to say, the educated people in towns who, surprise, surprise, performed better. And then, of course, the Welsh language was blamed for that. And one of the problems in, for instance, Montreal was, I mean, if you know the social fabric of Montreal, you have the kind of very posh English-speaking area like Westmount, where, the elite lives, private schools and so on, and then you have, so to say, the French-speaking working class quarters. Now, the moment you start control for this, suddenly it changed. It got opposite. So the earlier negative effects of bilingualism were in fact negative effects of lower social class, which changed exactly into the opposite once they were controlled for. So if you look at people coming from comparable education and social background, those who spoke more than one language were in fact performing better. So from this point of view, I can say we have now very nice evidence throughout, practically from birth to latest life, that learning languages is good. It doesn't confuse us. Again, it's fascinating because the confusion is exactly the same argument that is being used in dementia as it was in children. So when I was trying to speak with the Alzheimer's centers in Scotland, people said, but so you want to teach our patients another language, but that's dangerous. They might get confused. They will get agitated. And then we have to give them sedation, and then they fall, break their hip, and then it will be our fault. So there was really the idea that there is some kind of danger in learning another language, which might probably echo in Northern Ireland as well, and in some circles. And one of the great things after this trial we did was that we managed to convert people in nursing homes, because they said suddenly, wow, it was great. No one got confused, no one got agitated. In fact, it was something positive. So the argument of confusion is used at both ends of life, in childhood and in later life. Now, why people don't get confused? Now, let me now kind of summarize, because you can now ask what are the main cognitive effects of bilingualism. And I would say there are three main areas. And for each of them, I want to give an example. I mean, it's such a nice group. I hope you'll forgive me if I give a personal example. I speak of my own childhood. My own daughter is now 6, and I try to do exactly the opposite, to expose her to as many languages as possible. And I can give an example by her, so to say, for all the three structures or three areas. So the first most obvious one is, if you speak more than one language, you have a better so-called meta-linguistic understanding. So you understand language. You remember one day my daughter asked me, Daddy, how do you say envelope in Spanish and Polish? And I told her, well, in Spanish it's sobre, and in Polish it's koperta. And then she looked at me very surprised and said, but coperta sounds Spanish. Does the word coperta sound Polish or Spanish to you? Yes, you are right. It is a Latin loanword which entered Polish through Italian. So the phonology of this word is, in fact, similar to Spanish, not to Polish. So a 3.5 at that time old girl, without any formal training, could hear that this sounds really more like the one than the other. So she could recognize an Italian Latin loanword in Polish. So in a way that happens automatically. By the way, the same thing happens with writing. So one example, I tried to read her in Polish, and the word red in Polish is czerwone. Czerwone or czerwona, we have grammatical gender in Polish like you have in Irish or in Spanish. And then she looked at this czerwone and say, so ch is written in Polish CZ, but in Spanish and English CH. So again, without formal training, she realized that this is a clearer, so to say, that's the correspondence between grapheme and phoneme, we would say, between letter and sound is different languages. And in fact, that explains why, for instance, in America, we had really fascinating studies from Florida looking at English-speaking kids, so kids from English-speaking families that were sent to Spanish, bilingual Spanish-English school. Those kids were better in English orthography than those who went to monolingual English school. So that means learning Spanish not only gave them an additional language, it made them better writing in their own language, English. And in fact, my daughter started learning Spanish orthography, and she's one of the best in the class in writing, in English writing. So in a way, it's far from confusing. Kids are incredibly good in finding it out, comparing languages, and both written and spoken. Because sometimes you find also the kind of, in other myths, well, you can speak with 3 different languages, but with writing is different, you have to write in one language. And by the way, another example I told you about India. In India it's absolutely usual. Kids start going to school and then they learn in different alphabets, because most languages in India use a different alphabet from English. So it's absolutely normal, and they learn it like this. So that's the kind of metalinguistic knowledge. Very, very clear, and once you know 2 languages, learning a third is easier. Once you know 3, learning a fourth is easier, and so on. So in a way, as one of my colleagues lovely said, learn a language, get the other half prize. And I think it's a fantastic. So in a way, very often people think, oh well, all these languages will kind of, let's say, will confuse you, will, cram your mind and so on. No, exactly the opposite. You will find any other easier, because then you can compare it and you say, oh, that functions exactly like this, that functions like this, and so on and so on. And you notice probably if you go to language courses, the more languages people speak, the more faster they will pick up a new language. The second point is social cognition. Now, let me give you here a nice example. Again, my daughter, 3.5 at that time, or 4, when I told her in Polish, boli mnie głowa, which means I have headache, she would run to mommy and say, mommy, daddy has sore head. But if I said the same in Spanish, me duele la cabeza, she would not translate. So I did it a couple of times just to look if it's consistent. It was consistent. So she realized very, very fast that with daddy she can speak English, Polish, and Spanish, but with mommy only English and Spanish, because mommy doesn't understand Polish. So she would go and translate for mommy. And she has a good kind of playmate whose mother is Spanish and father is English, but makes an effort to learn some Spanish. And she would say very sweetly, yeah, Monica and Adrian speak Spanish, and Richard tries to speak Spanish. So kids are very good in realizing that different people have different linguistic repertoires. And from there, you have only a very small step to realize that different people might have different types of knowledge. What monolingual children find incredibly difficult to learn, that for instance, something that I know, someone else doesn't know. Because they think, if I know it, everybody must know it. Bilingual children don't have this problem, because they realize very, very fast that everybody comes with, so to say, their linguistic repertoire, and some people will know languages they don't know, some people will don't know languages they do know, so in a way, everybody has a certain level of knowledge. So they and you can, it's not only for languages. So for instance, there were experiments, very nice experiments by Kathleen Kunstler lab in America, where they were looking at children who were kind of, had to give things, but some of them were hidden, so that the other side couldn't see it. And the bilingual children very fast realize which objects the other children could see and which not. Whereas monolingual children didn't realize it because they were seeing the object, so they thought the other person must see them as well. So you have a difference in perspective taking. Now the third thing is equally important. Now all this knowledge would be completely useless if you wouldn't have a good mechanism of control to make sure that you really use the correct language. So if I come here and I realize, I know there are some Polish people in Ireland, so maybe some of you speak some Polish, but probably majority not. It would not help me very much if I knew that, if I couldn't control my linguistic output and speak to you in a mixture of Polish, German, English and Spanish. So the only way you can implement this social knowledge is through what we call executive function monitoring. So it's basically language control. And that explains why bilingual kids and bilingual adults tend to be better in switching between different things, because you have to, it's practically a permanent training for your brain. And that also explains why you get this delay in dementia. It's not necessarily that your memory will be better, but the way you use your memory is better. And that means, so even if you have a certain loss of memory, you will be much more efficient in practically using it, monitoring it, and so on and so on. And that gives the critical edge to people who speak more than one language. Now, it's important to say it's not that bilingualism is panacea, so it doesn't have with everything, and it has its costs. And the costs are very well described, and I was working on that as well. Bilinguals or multilinguals tend to be slower in naming tasks. So if you show a picture to someone and ask, can you tell as fast as possible what it is? Monolinguals are faster. No surprise, because they have to scan only one vocabulary, whereas as a multilingual you have to scan vocabulary in multiple languages. So basically, I would say if you have a big library, you will need more time to find a book than if you have a small one. So from this point of view, there is a cost, but I would say this cost is definitely worth it. So, kind of coming to the end, because I really want to leave some time for questions, I would say one of the crucial things here is, why do we have now this change in reappreciation of multilingualism? I mean, one is of course the empirical evidence. And we have now so many studies that it's very difficult for people to argue still in favor of confusion. But also our understanding of the brain has changed very much over the last 30 years. When I was doing my PhD, the understanding of the brain was very much influenced by the kind of computers of that time and the modules. So the idea was, in the brain we have these different modules, and every module does a different job. Because that was the computers that were available in the 80s or so. So the idea was, it's very difficult in this module to accommodate multilingualism, because either do you have then two separate modules for two languages or three, or do you have two languages in one module, in which case you really start confusing them. So this kind of very compartmentalized idea of the brain was, I would say, inhospitable to the idea of multilingualism. Now, our ideas of the brain changed dramatically over the last decades, I would say, as our technology changed. The biggest revolution, from my point of view, we have seen internet. We can now communicate fast, everybody's connected to everybody. And so the scientists have now a much more interactive idea of the brain. So the brain is not anymore a chest of drawers where you put things, and if you put one thing, then the other falls down. It is a series of connections. And now suddenly, multilingualism, instead of being a burden, is something positive, because it reinforces. So every time you learn a word in a new language, it activates all your words in other languages. So suddenly you have these networks which are working stronger and more efficiently, and you have a better executive functions to harmonize these networks. So from this point of view, I would say our current understanding of a brain as a highly interactive organ is much more open to the idea that in fact by adding languages we do something positive. And I described it in the paper, which by the way is open access, so I can tweet some of those things later on. I can give, because some of the articles are freely available, and one written last year is in fact specially, so to say, for in European Journal of Language Policy for broader audience. I was trying to describe this move together with my colleague Dina Mehmelbegovic from what I call the limited resources model to added value model. So what we had, let's say, 40 years ago would be a limited resources model. So you have only a certain space in the brain, and if you put an extra language, it pushes something out. So either you lose your mother tongue because you made an error to learn the other language, or, gosh, you learn two languages, they have no space for math. Sorry, you will be bad in math or physics or whatever. So that was the idea, limited resources models of late 20th century. Now, as I say, we have added value model. So by adding something to the system, you make it in fact working better. And I think, so from this point of view, I would kind of finish by saying that we have at the moment, on the one hand, overwhelming empirical evidence, but on the other hand, also much better models of the brain function, so that we can really reinterpret multilingualism as the normal state of human brain, and I would say monolingualism as an unfortunate but fortunately treatable linguistic deficit. And that's how I started, and I would like to finish. So I hope very much for many questions, so that we can go into some details if you are interested.
Bravo, bravo. So the failure of the Irish language movement has had a pup of the Celtic tiger. So our failure to speak our first language, Irish, has resulted in us being a computer, having a computer whiz kid economy.
Well, I mean, first, yeah. I mean, the situation.
Bad joke.
Yeah. I mean, the situation. I mean, the point is, as you know, you can tell me rather than the other way around. I would say the status of Irish in Ireland and in Northern Ireland is very different. Most Irish, I mean, Southern Irish or Republic of Ireland friends I have a rather bleak view of their own language. I mean, it's something they have to do at school. They don't necessarily like it. Whereas I would say in the North, I perceive an incredible enthusiasm of language. So it's a kind of, so I find, just from my own, I say, not systematic, is my more anecdotal.
Because the authorities are against it in the North.
Yes, maybe, exactly. So, I mean, it's something that I know very well in Poland. I mean, it was always said in Poland that, people will not read anything unless it is forbidden by the government, and then it will be printed out in the samizdat. And I remember one of the philosophers saying, well, it's so unfortunate no one really reads Plato and Aristotle because communists have never forbidden them. I wish they would forbid them, then everybody would know them. So in a way, I think there is a kind of counter-reaction. The second is maybe their language policy has not been particularly wise. But as I say, I mean, that would, my special area is neuroscience. And I have certainly interest in language policy, but I'm not a specialist in language policy and language education particularly. I would say there must be something that the Republic hasn't done particularly well with Irish, which, by the way, I have a feeling, we were speaking about it with Rama on the way, which I think Welsh, for instance, are doing better. I mean, I know that Welsh, government, I mean, they, for instance, invest a lot of money in Welsh soap operas, Welsh rock and pop bands and so on, popular culture, which in a way is something which probably will fascinate particularly teenagers, young people, adolescents more than, let's say, doing maybe the literature from medieval time. So from this point of view, I think if you want a kind of vibrant language, you have really to cover all all areas. But as I say, this is about language policy. But having said that, Irish are much better in learning foreign languages than are people from the bigger neighboring isle. So from this point of view, although maybe not everything has been done very well there, I would say they still have a edge over their English-speaking neighbors on the other isle.
The point I was trying to make was that in being bilingual, because we're all bilingual at the age of 13, and some of us are hating it,
yeah,
and not using it, depending on our teachers and our parents.
Yeah.
But as a result, I think that we are better at that. The Americans love coming here to run their computer companies.
Yes, I mean, yeah.
Have huge numbers employed, Irish people employed.
Yeah.
And now the managers are now Irish,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
very good. So I think it's no disadvantage.
I mean,
that's what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's certainly no disadvantage. I think it would be probably nicer if people would like it a little bit more. So in a way, I'm a hedonist at heart. So I kind of believe that we tend to do things slightly better if we do it out of love than if we do it out of duty or definitely out of fear. And but having said that, exercise is exercise. So let's say if you do running because you like running, or if you do running because there is someone behind you trying to hit you, the exercise for your heart will be still the same.
So, my question was, what in your studies, what was the threshold? What defines somebody's being bilingual? Because some of us learn languages in school, maybe starting at a certain bracket, but we wouldn't be using them every day.
Yeah.
Pick out a couple of phrases, a couple of sentences, that sort of thing. That's not necessarily bilingual.
It's an extremely good question. I think, for me, it's a very, I would say it's an operational definition of being able to use the language to a degree that you can really, in order to be able to switch, you need to have a certain vocabulary. So if your vocabulary consists only of, getting 2 beers in Spanish, then probably it will not really be enough. But it's not about perfection. And that's, I'm really glad that you asked this question, because I think that's where my approach, coming from medicine, is very different from approach of linguists. So for a long time, there were many linguists speaking about it, and particularly Chomsky and generative grammar and so on, they were interested in a kind of like idealized language. Chomsky said once, I'm not interested in all this kind of, dirty stuff like, sociolinguistics and how people use language and so on. I'm speaking about the ideal speaker in an ideal monolingual language community. Now, if that's your approach, then of course you get what you put in. So, the linguists were kind of looking only at idealized version of bilingualism as being able to speak both languages perfectly native-like and so on and so on. However, coming from medicine, as I said, I'm interested in practice and not in ability. So let's say if I'm interested, I very often use metaphors or analogies from physical exercise. Now let's say if I'm interested in the influence of swimming on your heart fitness, the ability that you can swim beautifully and all your crawl movements are absolutely perfect will probably not offer you much of cardiac protection if you never do it. On the other hand, if I go swimming regularly, even if my crawl is rather bad, I will still get the exercise that might be good for my heart. So from this point of view, for me, the crucial thing is not a perfect performance. The crucial thing is the practice. So I would say, certainly what I have done in my work is trying to shift the focus from perfection to practice.
Thank you for the lecture. It's a fascinating area of study and research. Does the research point to an optimal number of languages in terms of cognitive benefit, or is there peak multilingualism somewhere along the line?
A wonderful question. It's a paper which we have almost ready, and we spent like 1 year kind of trying to get the small details. The answer to it, so please don't record it because it's not published yet. So it's a secret. Don't tell it anybody. But because you are such nice people, I will tell you. Secret. But the point is, to start with, in biology, most curves are not linear. And I would say a lot of problems that we have in our modern world is that people always think in linear terms. If something is good, the more the better. If something is bad, the less. So, you can, like the saying, you cannot be too thin or too rich, and so on and so on. In fact, in biology, most curves are either like this, so logarithmic, so growing and then picking up, or in fact inverted U-shaped curve. So let's say temperature, we have a certain optimum temperature as humans, and I would say most people will find plus 50 relatively hot, and most people will find minus 40 relatively cold as well. So we function in a sense. Now, what we found with languages is a logarithmic curve. So you have the biggest difference between 1 and 2 languages, basically. Then it's a bit smaller from 2 to 3, and then the intervals get smaller and smaller. So you don't get necessarily negative effects, but you don't get an additional effect. So probably, I would say around 4 to 5, the curve flattens. And interestingly, this fits very much in what is the usual number of languages spoken in our hunter-gatherer societies. This is usually 3 to 4. Because as I remember, traditionally, people had 2 languages, mother and father. In many societies, there is a rule of linguistic exogamy. So it's a taboo to marry someone speaking the same language, which makes sense if you think that originally the linguistic groups were very small. They were like 500,000 people. Now, you can practically assume that if someone speaks the same language, your genes will be pretty similar. So one of the best ways of reassuring linguistic genetic variety was to marry someone from the same land. So you have it in Amazon, you have it in Africa, you have it in Australia, you have a lot of cases. So everybody grows up with 2 languages. Then when they marry, they have to learn another language. So that's 3. And usually there is a kind of trade language, which, lingua franca, which you use with different communities. So generally, I would say, like this guy from Ghana said, 3 to 4. That's probably what was the case for most of our evolutionary history, and I would say that's probably the optimum level. So, after 4, I'm a complete addict of language learning, I have to admit it. I'm kind of language junkie. But I would say after 4 or 5, you probably don't get much additional effect. Yeah?
Hi, thank you. In your studies, have you found any one model of language learning to be more beneficial than another, in relation to learning languages alongside each other?
Well, I haven't looked at that yet, and I would say there has been very little. You have to remember that looking at languages from the point of view of cognition is very, very young. The whole discipline is maybe 15 years old. Let's say the classical arguments for learning languages have always been culture, or maybe business, learn Chinese and they'll get your big business in China, and so on and so on. So, learning languages from the point of view of making you thinking, it's not quite correct. Because if you think about it, about 100, 150 years ago, when, for instance, people were learning Latin, one of the arguments at school was always that Latin teaches you logical thinking. I remember that I was hearing that still in Poland. So from this point of view, I'm simplifying, but let's say after Latin and Greek disappeared from the school curricula, general languages were looked at from the point of view of practical, usefulness. And it's only the last maybe 15 years that people start looking at the cognitive usefulness. Now the point is, it might not be the same learning a language, for instance, to get to learn it fast, but not be the way which is cognitively best. So you have to distinguish the 2 things. At the moment, we simply don't have research on that, and that is a question which I'm extremely interested in. At the moment, for instance, with Lingua Flamingo, we go very pragmatically. So what they try to do with the older people is, of course, to make, which I think most language teachers do generally, a very varied method. So a kind of, I would say, a tapas bar of linguistic approaches, because then it's very unlikely you might not like this game, but you will like the other one and so on. So if let's say you use in your 1.5 hours of language 5 different or 6 different ways of teaching it, probably at least 1 or 2 everybody will like. And that's what we do kind of pragmatically. But I mean, I don't know of any systematic study about that. One question which is related to it is, of course, also learning in class versus learning via apps. And again, we don't really have much work on that. There will be, in fact, in 3 or 4 weeks' time, I will be on BBC 2 in a program to Institute. Again, I will be tweeting it once I know exact date. So, I mean, BBC has just written to me it will be probably the last of the series, but they haven't confirmed yet. So there is on Wednesday evening, like Wednesday 20:30, so Wednesday 8:30 in the evening, there is a program called To Institute where they are teaching, or let's say 2 twins are doing something different, and then you compare how they perform. So they were already doing different, it's like 3 different things every evening or every week. And one of them was, in fact, they were asked to learn Swedish, but one of the twins did it, so to say, traditionally through a teacher, and the other did it through an app. And then when they went to Sweden, I mean, not surprising, the one who learned through a teacher was much faster in being able to use it practically. The other had kind of theoretical knowledge. But as I say, I mean, this is kind of more or less game. I mean, it's just, 2 people, there were 2 couples, so 2 female twins and 2 male twins. It was quite funny because they didn't know until the moment that they started which language they will learn. And when they had Swedish, of course, the boys were absolutely happy. Oh, the Swedish girls. So at least the motivation was there. And, for those who think that men are unable to learn a language, it's a definite prejudice. I don't think it's the case. And as I say, I mean, generally, I am myself in favor of learning in classroom. It might be because although I use, social media and so on, I still prefer direct communication with living human beings. And at least in our classes, particularly in older people and dementia, they love the fact that they work with other people. So in a way, language becomes also a method of getting social together. And in the time where we recognize loneliness as one of the big social problems of old age, I would say language classes again are one of the best ways to address it.
Hello, Dr. Mack. Thanks very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a background in languages. Sadly, I don't speak Irish, but hopefully that will change now with our new centre coming along. I learned Irish for 3 years at school, secondary school. I had the same teacher for Latin. I can speak neither Irish nor Latin. But from the same age I learned French and went on to become a French teacher. So the teaching methods, I think, will have a lot. I don't know if you find this. If you've got a good teacher and you're enthusiastic and they're enthusiastic, then you adapt to the language very quickly. Whereas if you have a teacher who's bored and not interested, then it turns you off the language. And I went on then in adulthood to learn German and Spanish to a lesser extent than I know French. But I just found, depending on who your teacher was, whether you were tuned into the language or not.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we are social beings. And at the end of the day, I mean, language, and most people learn language in order to communicate rather than in order to read. I mean, there are some occasions, of course, you can read, I had a colleague who sadly died just last December, professor of gerontology in Edinburgh, and he was learning Old Aramaic. In fact, he wrote his second PhD on the Qumran rolls. So he was very interested. If obviously there are not many people in Edinburgh with whom you can speak in ancient Aramaic, but he was relatively fluent, so to say, reading it and so on. So we don't know about those cases. But I think that the personality of teacher is absolutely crucial. It's not only for languages. I mean, let's say if you think of speech and language therapy, or even physiotherapy, whatever involves your active cooperation, then it is, the personality plays a role. And I would even say, it's funny that you ask, because now I remember many years ago, I was living in Germany at the time, and I was working in psychiatry, and I went to, every year there were Psychotherapiewochen, there were psychotherapy weeks. And once I met a woman who was in fact an anesthetist. So her job was putting people to sleep before operation. And I said, well, but so in the psychotherapy weeks. And she said, well, you are very mistaken. Since I've done my psychotherapy training, I noticed that my anesthesia is going much better. Because even although you might speak just a few minutes with the patient before you give the stuff, this will be enough to put them either in frame of mind of peace or in frame of mind of fear. And that has direct influence on your practically physical, biological functions during anesthesia. So from this point of view, I would say, if the personality plays a role even for anesthetist, it certainly plays a huge role for teacher. And just coming back to the discussion we had earlier, because we were exactly discussing this kind of problem with why in Ireland so many people don't like Irish. And in a way, maybe many of those teachers were just told they have to teach it without being terribly enthusiastic about it. Let's say, one of the things in Edinburgh you learn Gaelic is, if you send your kids to Gaelic school, and a lot of people who know Polish, German, Spanish and so on, send their kids to Gaelic school because firstly it's the only multilingual school in Edinburgh, but secondly because the teachers are really enthusiastic. You don't go and teach Gaelic unless you are really loving it. So in a way, you get at least, there might be different levels of capacity, but at least the enthusiasm is there for everybody. And that was also my impression because I was also giving talks to Gaelic teachers and so on. So from this point of view, you're absolutely right, but as I say, that is true for everything, including anesthesia.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I want to ask you a question about the Indian study you did, but can I make a comment
Sure.
or go there about teaching and the input of the teacher? There's a fascinating study called the hole in the wall experiment. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was actually done in a remote area in India, where somebody took a computer and put it in a hole in a wall in a remote location where young children were playing. Children who had never seen a computer before. And everything was written in English. And they observed the children interacting with the computer using remote cameras. And after a period of time, when they came back and spoke to the children were fascinated with this, started touching the screen, touch screen. And they cracked everything that was within the computer, and they taught themselves English. And I don't know how they did this, but I was kind of wondering, as you were talking about your study and about the number of languages and how it makes you better to be able to learn something new, new things, to be able to switch. And I was kind of fascinated with this, how they actually taught themselves a language that they didn't know, and then they were able to decipher everything that was going on in the computer program.
Well, I don't know about the study, so I would need to know kind of the detail to understand it better. But there are a couple of interesting things you can mention. One is that kids learn a lot just without formal education. So, the examples I gave you from my daughter were not, if she asked me, I give her explanations, but I'm very careful not to teach her linguistics, because then she would probably end up hating it for the rest of her life. So, so from this point of view, I think kids are by nature curious, and they observe things, and then they want to know why, and so on and so on. Recently, my daughter asked me, where does the sign hashtag come from? I had no clue. I don't know if anybody of you know. So in a way, so they will, they will question everything. So that's one point. So I think we should, my view. Some people would say I'm probably a bit of a hippie father, but I really believe that, giving diverse exposure is more important than kind of teaching. The second point is, those kids might have already known some English, because English is quite ubiquitous in India, even among illiterate people, particularly in areas where you have tourism. Because a lot of people, illiterate people in India, learn languages mainly because of trade. Because the more languages you speak, the better you can sell things. They are very clever. I don't know who said that, but it's very true. If you want to buy things, then English is enough. But if you want to sell things, you do it better in your client's language. So people learn very fast. I mean, if you go to a place where there are tourists, if you can, ask them something in English, you will get an effect. So a lot of kids, in fact, know, even if it's just, for trade or begging, whatever, they will know some English. But then the third point is, even if they don't know English, a lot of kids will be bilingual in different Indian languages, and then, of course, it will be much faster for them to crack the code, so to say, of a different language. So there are a lot of things which could play a role here.
Within your Indian study, you talked about protection of 4 years, and then the people who didn't have any
6 years.
Yeah, for 4 years, but then those who didn't have any.
There was a difference. The difference between illiterate bilinguals and illiterate monolinguals was 6 years, so 2 years more. So basically, the difference between the whole group, bilinguals and monolinguals, was 4 years. Exactly like in the Canadian study, and there's meanwhile also a study from Belgium, also pointing to 4 years. So we have 3 studies, completely different societies, different continents, very, very same amount of time. But interestingly, when you look at illiterate people, because you have illiterate monolinguals and illiterate bilinguals, there the difference was 6 years. So yeah.
Did you get any insight into why that group gets an extra 2 years? Because that's very significant.
Well, I would say,
as
yes,
opposed to 4.
that's right. But I would say again, we have to put it on its head. It's not that this group gets an extra. It's that the literate monolinguals get an extra. So I would argue, coming from the point of view that I perceive or I understand bilingualism or multilingualism as normal, that there is this kind of normal case. If you don't, you're so to say, if you only know one language, you get minus 6 years. But if you then go to school, this gives you 2 years extra. So from this point of view, I would say, it's not that the multilinguals get 2 years extra, it means that the monolinguals who go to school get an effect of education. And in fact, in this MCI study, we are looking separately at effects of education and bilingualism, and there we had 7 years difference between monolinguals and bilinguals, but 3.5 years due to education. So from this point of view, education can compensate. Let me give you a comparison against from physical domain. Imagine 2 people, of whom one has a very, very active lifestyle, walks to work or cycles to work, goes for a run and so on, is quite sporty, and the other spent all his time, let's say, works from home and spent all his time on his sofa watching TV. And then imagine these 2 people enroll now for a gym. Which of these 2 do you think will have more benefit? I would probably say the one who is sitting on the sofa, because he starts from a lower baseline.
Yes.
So that means that I think I'm not saying that multilingualism is the only way of getting mental exercise. There are a lot of different ways. And if you come from a kind of educated background, already as a child, I see it from the friends of my daughter. Oh God, they will be sent Monday to flamenco class, Tuesday to ballet, Wednesday to ikebana, Thursday to this and this. They get, all kind of mental stimulation. So in a way, which probably pushes them up in the performance. But if you have then someone coming, let's say, from a deprived background, where there is the parents sit and watch TV all the time, and there is no extra things, then language can be the main source of cognitive exercise. And that's why I find, this argument about, English being something, or in England, about language being something posh, completely missing the point. Because the people who will benefit most are exactly those from, let's say, migrant background, who have been told for decades, no, you shouldn't speak Punjabi or, at home, or you shouldn't speak, Hindi, you should speak English. So in a way, their main form of mental exercise is being robbed of them because of the false language policy. And in a way, if we already come into politics, one of the things where I am really very active and fighting at the moment is the census. British census allows people to have multiple ethnic identities, multiple national identities, but only one language. We are only allowed one language. I find it's completely absurd. Of course, it underestimates completely the number of languages used. So, and in a way, so the only thing I try to introduce is that people are allowed which languages do you speak rather than, you know, which language which is your main language, and then you put one language, that's it. So in a way, you see, I mean, this monolingual default is so deeply ingrained. You know, I went to the, you know, Scottish National Records in Edinburgh. I went to the Office for National Statistics in London. Those people don't get it, that people don't have just one language. So their idea is, you come to Britain, you have to forget your language, speak just English, and if you speak other language, it's very bad for your English. It means that you are a traitor, and you know, you just speak English. That's it. I mean, that's how British statistic authorities think. And the problem is, it then produces false statistical results, which are then feeding back into giving false statistics, because people feel almost scared to put any other language. They will probably kick me out of the country when I write Punjabi or Polish or whatever, so I write English. And then they would say, well, in fact, no one really speaks any other languages than English, so why should we bother? So you have a circulus viciosus, a vicious circle of questions practically forcing people to pretend they are monolingual, and then this being used as an argument for monolingualism.
Could I offer a theory on how to learn a language?
Yep.
Will you learn from me?
Mm-hmm.
Will you learn from me if I tell you, yeah?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so the mistake we make is we begin with grammar.
Yeah.
And then the student is not, it's a big barrier. Rules, regulations.
Yeah, yeah.
Too many rules. But the way that we should learn is to be studying a subject of interest to the student. So in the Ireland, you're studying history.
Yeah.
So in my mind, history number one, geography number one, geology.
Yeah.
But geography, whatever. And through the learning of history and that you're now learning the language.
Yeah.
If you start the other way, what's happened in Ireland, not interested.
Yeah.
Many people. But now I'm learning something I want to learn.
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of motivation aspect. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the grammar comes in at the end, not at the beginning or during.
Well, I mean, there are two things. I mean, one is the topic and the other is grammar. I would, regarding topic, I couldn't agree with you more, and I give you a nice example from my own childhood. The first language we had to learn was, of course, Russian, because that was the language of the empire. And the Russian program was absolutely awful. So you were learning about, you know, the young years of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, or about, you know, or about the harvest in the state-run, you know, or in fact, the only love story they had was about a boy and girl where she works in a factory, or he works in a factory and he works on field, and then they speak about the machines and whatever. I mean, not quite what we had in mind as adolescents. But we had a very, very good teacher who was trying to do as little as possible with rubbish, and for instance, teach us Russian poetry, which is absolutely amazing, including love poetry, by the way. So, from this point of view, I mean, she took as much liberty as the system permitted, with the effect that, in fact, I quite enjoyed learning Russian, although most of my schoolmates hated it. So that's the question of topic. I think this is absolutely clear, and it relates what you said also with the kind of personality of the teacher and so on. I think the teacher has to be right, the topics have to be right. So for instance, what we teach, I mean, our dementia patients, the two languages we are teaching mainly is Spanish and Italian, because most of them either have been on holidays there or want to go on holidays there. So you learn, you go on holiday, you do sightseeing, and so on, so on. So that's clear. The question of grammar is a little bit more complicated, because in a way you can also learn a language. Some people go, I would say, into the other extreme and say, well, you don't teach grammar at all, you just, you know, hear the things and then you will get it. But then the danger is that you will end up speaking a kind of really, you know, broken language and never really go beyond that. So, and I mean, that's what you have very often. I mean, let's say a classical, when I was in Germany, I mean, there was even a very pejorative term, Türkendeutsch, so the German spoken by the Turks, which were the Gastarbeiter, the worker who came. They never got any formal education, so they were speaking enough German to kind of, you know, understand their work, but they couldn't produce really grammatical sentences. So I don't like both extremes. At the moment, my own intuition, but that would be interesting how you see it, because for instance, one of the problems, I think one of my Gaelic teacher, in fact, explain a little bit too many rules. My vision at the moment is that you need to leave people some time to discover the rules. And then you correct them if they didn't get it right. It takes more time, but I think it also settles more. So let's say, instead of saying, I presume it would be in Irish similar, the article, so it's a and an, and then if it's with, starting with s, you put the te, and so on and so on. Okay, if you explain it like this, you can go through it within half an hour probably, but then you will forget it within half an hour. But if you, let's say, write 100 words with the article and say, let's try now to find out what is the rule, then you get people more actively engaged. And that's also the way how children really learn language. So children are famous for generalizing. And I see my daughter, famous, I eat it, I win, and so on. So they will do regular past tense, and then they learn, oh no, it's not eat it, it's eaten, and so on. She does the same in Spanish. So for saber, to know, she would say sabo, and then now she finally learned it's se, because it's irregular, and then she was teaching her friend who is 1 year older would say, oh, sabo, and say, no se dice sabo, se dice se. So from this point of view, I think probably grammar needs to be taught, but maybe not, so to say, confrontational, but rather kind of exploratory, leaving people a chance to discover the rules for themselves. It takes more time, but I think it's more satisfying, and it sticks for longer. Yeah.
Just thanks very much for your talk. Just in terms of maybe parents raising children bilingually or etc., what do you think is the best approach? I myself have a 2-year-old son. I choose only to speak Irish with him, with my partner only speaking English to him. But what do you find is the best approach? Obviously my son's starting to realise now that I will speak Irish only to him, but when I talk to my partner, speaking in English, so he will, he knows I have the English, so he won't speak to me back in Irish, but he will understand everything that I say to him in Irish.
But that means your partner doesn't speak Irish?
Yes, well, she will understand Irish,
but won't speak, yes, yeah.
Not speaking Irish. Definitely can relate to what you're saying about, you were talking earlier about, you were saying to your daughter about, I have a headache, and then she would tell her mother in Polish, Daddy has a headache or whatever, and if I the same with Irla, I would say something to Irla, like, get me this off Mommy, and he will go and ask Mommy in English, can I have that, and bring it back to me, or whatever. But what do you think is the best approach for parents who are in that situation where do you think one language, one parent is the best approach, or?
Now, a kind of question, how many people here know the name Gina Ford? Gina Ford. No, I mean, she is, because when when it was clear that, my daughters were on the way, I was kind of looking through different literature. Gina Ford is an author who herself never had children, but writes, how to raise children in an extremely authoritative manner, and, you have to raise them 5 to 7, and then 5 past 7 you have to do this, and then 7:15 you have to do this, and so on and so on. Needless to say, I didn't follow Gina Ford's advice. Now, I think there is no really one single model. And I know that many people had this deeply ingrained one person, one language. If it works, fine, but you don't have to do it like this. So in a way, I would say in your case, it's perfect because, let's say, if your partner would know perfectly Irish as well, then, your kids will find out very fast that it's the case, and then it looks a bit unnatural why you don't speak to each other in Irish. But if the child notices that Daddy speaks it really well, and then Mommy understands a bit, then it's quite natural that you speak in Irish and she will be speaking English. So in your case, you have the comfort or the convenience that you can do a very honest system, and it works perfectly well. Generally, I would say it depends on many other things. So let's say, for instance, if you are living in a country where generally the minority language is the one which is most important. So some people, let's say in Britain, would say, oh well, I will speak Polish, but maybe the father will speak, English and so on. Rubbish. I mean, kids will learn English anyway. I mean, if you live in an English-speaking country, the only way to prevent your kids from learning English is to lock them and not let them out. Unless you do it, they will learn it to a degree that they will start teaching you. My daughter already corrects my English pronunciation all the time. She would say, Daddy, it's not tuna, it's tuna. Repeat after me. Tuna. And she has a certain satisfaction that, although Daddy is quite good in languages, she can still correct him. So from this point of view, kids will get it like this. So you can be absolutely honest. So from this point of view, you are in the most convenient situation. So that's perfect how you are doing it, because you are completely, in line. Now the point is, I would say, for instance, because Irish, if your partner were a perfect Irish speaker, then probably speaking Irish at home would be better, because that's probably a weaker language. But on the other hand, I know, for instance, a Spanish speaking family in Edinburgh, where I think they are both, I think she's from Spain, her partner is from South America, I know, Venezuela or Colombia or so. And he speaks English and she speaks Spanish, because they say, well, at some point we are thinking of moving to Spain. Now, we would like our daughter to understand English as well. And if we move to Spain and then suddenly start speaking English at home, it will look very, very strange. So they are doing it, so to say, as preparation for the move to Spain, because then the father will continue speaking English so that the child will continue have... So from this point of view, I think there are really many models, and you have to look at all families. As I say, if you can do one part and one language, it's wonderful. But it's not that, if you don't do it, it's a mortal sin, and your child will grow up, speaking a mixture. As I say, it's probably the most convenient model, but, as I say, it depends on the situation and what is the best.
So, well done. That was great. It was very interesting, and you had everybody totally engaged, which is what you set out to. When you were talking about the Russian literature and the man working in the factory and the woman working
on the field,
or vice versa, I couldn't help thinking that would be a bestseller over here, and maybe men are from Mars and women are from Venus.
I see, yeah. So it's.
Do you know something? We've had a long day, and it's been a wonderful day, and that's been a fantastic overview of your research. And I don't really watch soccer that much, but sometimes the soccer managers impress me with their ability to get their message across on TV, even though they may not have all the education in their new language. But after a couple of months, they're prepared to give it a go, and I think we could take something from these people. Why not just give a new language a go? Because you don't have to, and that's maybe one of the issues that you were mentioning there, the gentleman from the little county there, that in Irish sometimes, and in Ireland sometimes, we set ourselves impossible goals, and we aim for absolute perfection. And if we don't reach that, particularly when it comes to education, we feel bad. And we shouldn't. I'm learning Spanish now on Duolingo, and on Duolingo you learn to speak, you learn to read, you learn to write, and I do 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes during the middle of the day, and 10 minutes at night. And I know you mentioned that maybe apps aren't the best thing, and they're not, but then I went to Spain during the summer there, and I was a bit like one of those soccer managers tramping around Spain on the Camino, trying to use my basic Spanish. But because I'm used to teaching the Irish language, I know that most people realise that you're not going to get up to degree level so quickly, and we have to cut ourselves some latitude in this country. And another thing that you mentioned to me today, I'm not going to ask you to go into the details, but the amount of money that is spent on the promotion of languages. I imagine in Wales, where they're having success, they're spending probably the right amount of money, and they could still spend more. But in other areas on these islands, I imagine that they are not spending nearly as much in the promotion of languages compared to other areas of expenditure that not all of us support. And finally, when you spoke about how learning an additional language can have health benefits, these benefits are practically free of charge. And that is a great benefit, but it's also a problem because, as you know, our society is always trying to monetize everything. So if it could be sold in a bottle, your wonderful news, it probably would take off more readily. But you're not speaking to ordinary capitalists here tonight. You're talking to people who understand the value of languages. So can I, on your behalf, thank Thomas H. Back for a wonderful talk tonight. And he'll be about for a wee while. And Liam wants to take photographs, so Gurkhaid Maigah, thank you very much. And the tea and coffee will still be warm, and there are plenty of bickies, so not many of you took tea and coffee on the way in, so please help yourself and stay around and let Liam take a few photographs, because we want to get our good news out there on social media. So Gurkhaid Maigah B'Charge.
Exactly, and you know, if you want up-to-date information, it's all will be all on the Twitter.